Directed and co-written by Yusron Fuadi, we are talking The Draft, or at least that is the English translation of this Indonesian movie. Now, this is effectively the Indonesian equivalent of The Cabin in the Woods, a meta horror film that is deconstructing horror tropes. So let me explain the plot, then I'll kind of give you an example of what I mean. So the film focuses on five 20-year-old kind of college-age students as they are heading to a villa in the woods for a bit of a getaway. It's very remote and quite run down. When they get there, you know, there's a graveyard nearby, and they kind of joke about how it almost seems like a horror film. And not long after they arrive, one of these young people end up getting killed through kind of mysterious circumstances. And this causes our remaining young people to try and escape, only to find out they can't. They seem to be trapped in this area, and they come to the realization that they are actually in a movie script where the writer is kind of changing things as they kind of go along, and these protagonists actually can somewhat influence the writer by what they are doing. And how will they escape? How will they survive? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let me give you an example of kind of what I mean by this, how this movie kind of plays out. Towards the end of the movie, we have a kind of a zombie attack, and one of the characters, who is the nerdy character, you know, he is the nerdy character by his own admission. He points out that these are classic zombies, aka slow-moving zombies, and someone sort of questions it and says, "What do you mean classic zombies?" "Oh, they're slow-moving. Anything that came out after the year 2000 were fast-moving zombies." And then straight away, these zombies turn into fast-moving zombies because he has given the writer, this kind of godlike figure almost in this movie, the idea. They said, stop giving the writer ideas, things like that. So that's kind of how this movie plays out. So let's discuss. So obviously this is a movie made for horror fans. This is definitely not one for casual audiences because it's like The Cabin in the Woods. It is a deconstruction of horror movies and its tropes, and just the kind of the script writing sort of profession, I suppose, as a whole. So, you know, it's talking a lot about the kind of the horror stereotypes and cliches and tropes and things like this. So again, if you're not particularly kind of well versed in horror movies, it might just seem, it might go over your head, to be quite frank. However, if you are a horror fan, you might enjoy the kind of the recognition of all of these kind of like horror tropes, even to the point where they actually going on about Indonesian horror films in particular and things like that, and how things, you know, will happen in Indonesian films, like even like to do with like color grading. There's comments on things like this. So it's a very kind of deep dive, meta look at the horror genre, and specifically the Indonesian kind of horror cinema, you might say. So again, it's obviously quite a in-depth script. It's obviously kind of quite inside baseball and quite complex to a large degree. You know, the whole concept of our characters living in a kind of ever-changing script is, you know, certainly an ambitious idea here. And, you know, they're definitely having fun with it. It's kind of a comedic horror in many ways, where our characters are trying to, you know, find their best route without kind of necessarily giving the writer ideas to stitch them up any further and things like this. And, you know, we kind of see the writer writing his script really without any, in kind of, it's almost like a separate sort of sequences and things like this. There's a variety of different kind of like horror elements that are kind of introduced, and it kind of initially it plays a little bit like The Evil Dead, and it's definitely kind of touching base with kind of a lot of the things you have kind of seen before, and you'll enjoy some of the kind of like the takes on the horror tropes down to very much like The Cabin in the Woods did with the kind of like the, you know, the different sort of styles of characters, the tomboy girl, the kind of the quiet girl, the nerdy guy, the jock guy, things like this, and then actual events and things that happen in just horror films and stuff like that. There is quite a lot of kind of, this is very somewhat of a dialogue driven movie, so it is a lot of kind of like these characters discussing that. So again, if you are a fan, you might enjoy these kind of like these kind of quite fun conversations that kind of break down these kind of horror tropes and how they might kind of circumvent their situation, and how shall they survive. So it's quite fun, and the movie, because of its unpredictable nature, you never quite know what's going to happen. There's kind of all of a sudden, as I say, a zombie, which is a zombie attack towards the end. You get these kind of like possession types where they're trying to pull their own mouth apart. We get recasts and things. So it's kind of like quite a crazy film in many ways, and you never really know what's going to kind of happen. So in some respects, it's kind of quite unpredictable and a bit of a surprise, really. As I say, I do definitely think it helps if you are a fan of horror movies. I think the cast are actually asked to do quite a lot of heavy lifting here, going from the characters that they are kind of originally portrayed to this more realised, realising that they're actually fictional characters and they don't really have much backstory, so they don't even know their parents' names and things like this. So the cast are asked to do quite a lot here, and I think, it's always a little bit difficult to judge foreign language movies because I'm reading subtitles, so it's kind of hard to kind of tell if the performances are really that strong, but they seem to be fine to me. It's relatively effects light, to be honest, but we get a little bit towards the end, and I think it was the smart move to save that kind of like the more overt sort of on-screen stuff towards the end. What doesn't work? So as I say, I think this movie is somewhat inaccessible for, I would say, the majority of all audiences. Even casual horror fans, I feel, might struggle to get to grips with it, if I'm completely honest. As I've kind of alluded to, the movie is very, very dialogue driven. Now, for a movie about writing, this movie has a lot of exposition in it. Like, a lot of exposition. There is lots of telling rather than showing. This may be down to a budgetary issue, but ultimately it is lots of these characters, the four kind of remaining characters, discussing things, arguing about things. We get a little bit of kind of running around, chasing and things like this, but not much actually on screen. And as I say, we get a little bit more towards the end, but even then it's relatively short-lived. So there's a lot of kind of like exposition dumps, to be honest. And again, where a film is commenting on the writing of horror films, it's almost a little bit surprising that it's so exposition heavy. And they don't comment on that. So, as fun as the kind of the concept is, it's also a victim to its own ideas, if that makes sense. Visually speaking, it's not particularly interesting. Even when we get our kind of our more overt horror stuff towards the end, we get this kind of like this brief zombie attack. It's not all that impressive, if we're being honest. And again, this may well be down to budgetary issues, but it's kind of just like a bunch of people with a little bit of blood on them kind of running towards the camera. It's nothing especially sort of graphic or groundbreaking in regards to kind of VFX or visual kind of spectacle. The actual concept of the movie, it's a hard one to wrap your head around. I think in The Cabin in the Woods, you could they kind of give you a reason why all this stuff is happening, like an in-world reason why they are doing this, why they have selected these people, things like this. This one doesn't really have that. So the concept is a little bit out there for some, I would say. And it's a little bit hard to believe that someone, as one of the kind of the protagonists, actually thought that this was happening. I mean, how would you think that? It's like if you and I were in a horror film or just a situation, and I said to you, I actually think we're characters in a script of a movie, just kind of out the blue, because things are a little bit strange. It just seems like, how would you come up with that idea? So I don't know if it's particularly sort of as thought out as, say, The Cabin in the Woods, for example. And ultimately, visually, it's nowhere near as interesting because it's just a lot of people talking for a lot of the time. So ultimately, it's a kind of fun idea that I think ardent horror fans shall probably somewhat enjoy. to a degree, but it's nowhere near as classic as other kind of meta horror films, you know, a Cabin in the Woods, Scream, things like that. And I think it is crumbles a little bit under its own weight and ambition here, and I don't think it quite holds up. So it's a 5 out of 10 for me. Would you see it based on what I've told you? Have you seen it? Please do let me know your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you next time.